Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we are unpacking something absolutely wild. Seriously, it's a piece of historical source material that feels like it was ripped straight out of a Hollywood blockbuster. But, the implications go way, way beyond just a battlefield. We're diving into the 1565 Siege of Malta. We're going to look at the raw, honestly harrowing history of this clash, and then see how our source uses this intense narrative to pull out some really deep philosophical takeaways about the very nature of conviction. It is this fascinating blend of history and ideology, so let's get into it. Okay, right off the bat, let's start with the exact question our source poses. When we think about strength, is it best defined as the power to crush your enemy, or is it the resolve to stand? Think about that for a second. When literally every force on Earth demands you kneel, and fear is screaming at you to run, what kind of person actually stays on their feet? Keep that question in the back of your mind, because it perfectly frames the extreme psychological and physical intensity of the battle we're about to break down. Section 1. The Last Crusader Outpost. The year is 1565, and the place is Malta. To really grasp the stakes here, you have to picture this barren rock in the Mediterranean facing the ultimate David versus Goliath scenario. On one side, just 500 Knights of St. John, backed up by a few thousand local Maltese peasants and volunteers. That's it. On the other side, an armada carrying 40,000 elite Muslim soldiers of the Ottoman Empire, and that includes the Sultan's terrifying Janissaries. Our source describes this massive fleet showing up like a dark storm cloud rolling over the sea, bringing this menacing thunder of drums and chanting. Their goal was simple: completely erase this final stronghold standing between North Africa and Europe. No big deal, right? Now, you might be wondering, why on earth didn't those 500 knights just pack up and leave? Well, the brutal reality is they had absolutely nowhere left to run. These were Catholic warrior monks who had been steadily pushed back for over 2 centuries. Driven from the Holy Land back in 1291, retreated to Rhodes, which they lost in 1522, and finally, they end up on Malta. As our source points out, if this island fell, Rome itself was next on the chopping block. They were cornered, massively outnumbered, but absolutely dead set on holding the line. Moving into Section 2, the Bloody Siege, starting at Fort St. Elmo. The horrific reality of this clash really kicked off at a strategic choke point called Fort St. Elmo. 28 days. Just think about that. That is how long the defenders there stood against the full, crushing weight of the Ottoman siege. The source describes them enduring wave after relentless wave of screaming Janissaries. And when the walls were finally breached, the fighting got so desperate that men were clashing head-on with broken swords, even bare hands. It was a grueling, agonizing month of nonstop violence. But man, did they make the Ottomans pay for it. Before Fort St. Elmo finally crumbled, those trapped defenders managed to take 6,000 Ottoman soldiers down with them. Essentially, they sacrificed themselves just to buy the rest of the island time to prepare. When the Ottoman forces finally broke into the fort, they didn't find a single survivor, just corpses and a cross. What followed was just brutal psychological warfare. Our source details how the Ottomans actually crucified the bodies of the fallen knights and floated them across the harbor, literally just to mock the remaining defenders on the opposite shore. The conditions through June and July were absolutely visceral. The island was on fire, the knights were starving, wounded, and fighting in rusted armor slick with blood. It was a literal nightmare scenario. Which brings us to Section 3, Miracle at Malta, the turning point. So we move into the climax of the battle in August, and the survival tactics are getting incredibly grim. The defenders are completely out of food. They're actually boiling leather just to make soup. Leather. Yet every single night they are out there rebuilding their shattered stone walls by hand. But the real turning point? It was environmental. The punishing summer heat basically turned the Ottoman camps into ovens. Disease and rot just swept through the invading ranks. And here's the crazy part. While the Ottomans are sickening in their camps, the sound of singing is rising from the Christian walls. The starving knights were chanting hymns. Their resolve was somehow hardening, even as their physical bodies were literally failing them. Then, finally, in September 1565, relief arrives. A force of 6,000 Spanish and Italian men landed on the island, and upon seeing them, the 70-year-old Grand Master of the Knights, Jean de Valette, orders his bleeding, half-dead defenders to race from the gates in one final, desperate charge. And it worked. The remnants of the greatest army on earth broke their lines, turned, and fled. The final toll was just monumental. 30,000 Ottoman soldiers lay dead on the rocks of Malta. Our source highlights that historians view this as one of the most decisive battles in world history. It was the exact moment the tide of the Ottoman advance into Europe was stopped in its tracks. The battle was over. The island had held. Section 4. Defining true strength and our source's ideological takeaways. Now that we've got the historical facts down, our explainer is going to pivot a bit. The creator of our source material uses this history to mount a very specific theological argument, starting with this powerful quote from Grandmaster de Valette. "A man of faith and courage will not yield even when the whole world is against him." The creator uses this to argue that the knight's unyielding conviction wasn't born out of military superiority at all, but out of something deeply internal and spiritual. The source's core thesis here is that discipline is freedom. The idea is that the Knights of St. John didn't stand their ground because they had some, tactical hope of actually winning. They stood because they had sworn an oath. The creator argues that true freedom doesn't come from just doing whatever you want, but from bringing your will under strict obedience. Through that intense discipline, they found a freedom from fear that allowed them to hold the line when anyone else would have broken. Breaking this concept down, the source outlines what it calls the anatomy of a vow. These warrior monks trained their bodies to obey their souls, and their souls to obey their faith. According to the author, they didn't run when the cannons roared because they had already died to themselves long before the battle even started. They didn't have to wait around for some fleeting feeling of inspiration to be brave, right? Their intense spiritual discipline meant the strength was already there. Moving to Section 5, Suffering and Brotherhood and the Modern Critique. Taking this analysis a step further into modern critique really requires understanding this concept of redemptive suffering. It's a Catholic concept where suffering is viewed not just as some random, pointless tragedy, but as a forge, a place where love is tested, pride is burned away, and obedience is perfected. The creator argues that because the knights fully embraced this concept, their agony on the walls of Malta became this sanctified endurance. They didn't just die like ordinary soldiers. The argument asserts they died like saints, completely bound together by meaning. This builds into the source's sharpest critique, contrasting the Knights' brotherhood with the modern world. The creator argues that today we are basically raised on isolation and taught that independence is the ultimate goal. Modern society, according to the source, recoils from discipline. We want the reward, the resurrection, without the sacrifice of the crucifixion. In stark contrast, the knights relied on a profound dependence on each other and a shared mission. They treated their faith not as a private opinion to keep to themselves, but as a binding public vow. To summarize this perspective, the ultimate takeaway presented by our source is that faith, shaped by rigid form, prayer, penance, sacrament, and brotherhood, is the only thing that can actually endure a true siege. The argument being made here is that by chaining your will to a higher truth and strict habits, you prevent yourself from being ruled by fleeting emotions, fear, or worldly appetites. Which brings us to the final, provocative thought left to us by the creator of the source material. On the days you wonder, what kind of man am I supposed to be? Will you remember Malta? Regardless of your own personal worldview, you have to admit, it is a fascinating challenge. Will you rely on momentary inspiration, or will you build the kind of disciplined resolve that allows you to stand when the whole world is demanding you kneel? It's a heavy question to leave you with, for sure, but an incredibly memorable one. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep exploring, and I'll catch you on the next one.